Welcome back. I'm Jeff Hix, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hix, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. Now, the thing that differentiated Strange As It Seems from Ripley's Believe It or Not, its number one competitor back in the day, was that John Hix insisted that every fact he published be true. In fact, he would write at the bottom, "If you doubt this, write for proof to the author," which his fans did. He got letters all the time saying, "Hey, I didn't really believe this was true," or "Can you prove this?" And what he did was he kept folders by subject of all the letters, photographs, affidavits, articles, everything you can imagine that would prove these facts true. And growing up as a kid, I found these folders fascinating with all the letters and photographs and digging through them. And here in the 21st century, I'm bringing all these wonderful and fascinating stories and their proof back and sharing them with you. So for this week's episode, I came across this folder on elections, miscellaneous and foreign, which I thought an interesting subject, especially considering the times that we live in today. So let's dive in to 8 election antics that will get your vote for being weird. And for the first example of election hijinks, we go back to 1935, the first time that elections appeared as a subject, apparently. And we have, in ancient Persia, written ballots were used in elections. Votes were inscribed on olive leaves. It was an interesting enough fact that, Strange As It Seems, published it again in 1953. And the next story that appears in the file on elections, it looks like John Hix ran across on October 12th of that year, 1935, in the Literary Digest. On the left side, interestingly enough, there's an article on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's legislation that the Supreme Court was hearing. This was the 7th or 8th year of the Depression, and Franklin Roosevelt was putting out all of the legislation about the New Deal that the Supreme Court was reviewing, according to the Washington Daily News, which explains this concerns the huge inscription on the front of the building, "Equal justice before the law." The complaint is that if it isn't equal, it can't be justice, and hence it's surplus usage to speak of equal justice. Fascinating. But what caught John Hix's eye was the article on the American Federation of Labor, who had a new president, William Green. But in this article, they talked about how the ghost of Samuel Gompers hovers near. Rarely have the delegates wandered from the precepts dictated by this formidable thick-set cigar maker from the London slums, who 40 times was elected president of the organization which he helped bring to life in 1881. Fascinating. I also saw on the back here, it's a cartoon of the Republican Party showing his parents questioning a suitor, the suitor being Herbert Hoover, who at the time was considering challenging Roosevelt again for the presidency. Hoover was the president prior to Roosevelt that presided over the beginning of the Great Depression, and here he is contemplating a comeback, although in 1936, Roosevelt ended up winning again over Alf Landon, who was the Republican candidate at the time. Fascinating time in American history. And here is the letter from November 9th, where John Hix writes to the Secretary of the American Federation of Labor, "I'm informed that Samuel Gompers was president of the American Federation of Labor 40 times. It seems to me this would make a most interesting subject for Strange As It Seems, my nationally syndicated newspaper feature, and I would appreciate your verifying this fact for me." And in response, we have this lovely letter from the American Federation of Labor to Mr. John Hix. "Dear Sir, your letter of November 9th has been forwarded from our New York office. In reply thereto, you will find enclosed herein a biographical sketch of the late Samuel Gompers, for nearly half a century president of the American Federation of Labor. Under separate cover, I'm sending you one of his pictures. I served as President Gompers' secretary for a long period of years, up to his death in 1924. I would appreciate you sending me a copy of any article you published in regards to him." And quite a bit of information here on Samuel Gompers. We have a timeline of his life, official labors of the service, complete history of his life, many pages typed, as well as a eulogy on the late Samuel Gompers, extension of remarks made by the Honorable John Casey of Pennsylvania in the House of Representatives in February of 1925. And here's the beautiful picture of Samuel Gompers, which John Hix used in the illustration, and which he published on January 27th of 1936, Samuel Gompers was elected president of the American Federation of Labor 38 times. What's a politician's favorite footwear? Flip-flops. Next up, we had a printed fact that was interesting to me because it didn't have a comic strip attached, but Angus Moore, 96 of Galesburg, Illinois, has voted for every Republican president since 1856. Although that was never turned into a comic strip, we did find Almer Sherman about 10 years later in the New York Sun on October 31st, Halloween, 1937. Voter, 80 years old, plans to cast his 59th straight Republican ticket. And the letter to Mr. Almer Sherman. Dear Mr. Sherman, in doing research work for Strange As It Seems, my nationally syndicated newspaper feature, I have come across an interesting item concerning your record as a voter. It is said that you have cast 59 straight Republican ballots, your first presidential vote, having been cast for President Garfield. And here we have a letter from Doris Sherman. The information that you have concerning my grandfather, Almer Sherman, is correct. I do not know whether or not that is the best record of its kind. You have his permission to use the story, but he's not extremely fond of much publicity. He says that he always considered party principle when he votes rather than the principles of the candidates themselves. His argument has always been, if one yellow dog is worth voting for, they all are. He has been elected Justice of the Peace in his hometown 6 times. He's been elected trustee of the school district 40 times out of 52 years living in the district. He enjoys fairly good health and expects to cast a Republican vote in future elections. I hope the snapshot enclosed will answer your purpose. He hasn't any real good snapshots. If I may help you anymore, please let me know. Yours truly, Doris Sherman, and perhaps one of the few, if any, remaining photographs of Almer Sherman, which John Hix used as best he could for the comic strip on April 20th, 1938, about Almer Sherman, who cast 59 straight Republican ballots. What's the difference between a congressman and a pizza? A pizza can feed a family of 4. And for the next of our crazy election hijinks, we have the weighing in of the mayor. It's part of the regular induction ceremonies at High Wycombe, England. The event takes place in the public market square, apparently still is today. I looked in the information here and I thought, why are they doing that? And apparently, as I did a little further research, and if the mayor weighs more than he did the year before, he's booed because the assumption is he hasn't been doing any work. That would be an interesting ritual to put place in today with the American president, wouldn't it? And next up, we have the John Hix scrapbook from April 7th, 1940, with 6, count them, 6 Congressional Curios. The first, William Charles Cole of Claiborne, served a full term in Congress before he was legally qualified to even hold office. He began his term at 22. Number 2, Uncle Joe Cannon's unequal record of 46 years in Congress. He was twice defeated between 1873 and 1923, however. Number 3, the famous Henry Clay. He was elected Speaker of the House the same day he took office. Number 4, Isabella Greenway of Arizona, who was elected to Congress by the greatest percentage of plurality ever given a candidate by her home state. Way to go, Isabella. And number 5, Galusha Grow was first elected to Congress in 1850 and ended his last term in 1903, 53 years later. And lastly, we have the 3-in-1 Senator, James Shields, famous American general, who served as a U.S. Senator from 3 different states, Illinois, Minnesota, and Missouri. Makes you wonder if maybe we should put a transfer portal together for senators. What do you call a politician that tells the truth? Retired. And in our next election antic, here in 1943, John Hix came across the fact that in Australia they had a reverse poll tax. It costs Australians a fine of £2, which at the time was about $8. I think today it'd be about $1.25. But it cost them £2 not to vote. What a great idea. Wonder how that might change elections if we did that today. And this first submission from my grandfather, Ernest Hix, who took over the comic strip from my grand uncle John after he passed away in July 1944 from heart disease. And here we have in September, where Ernest publishes little known fact that back in colonial North Carolina, to vote for a representative, only your taxes had to be paid. But to vote for a senator, you had to own 50 acres. And this election antic from Puerto Rico in 1940, the Puerto Rican political party in power paid thousands of farmers for their votes, and the farmers at once turned the money over to the penniless opposition for a campaign fund. And almost without exception, the farmers came into the People's Party headquarters and turned the money over for a campaign fund. In some instances, they asked if they could keep 50 cents of it. This from the Inter-American magazine, November of 44. It doesn't say which party won in the election, however. Of course, Grandpa Ernest didn't have Google at the time, which I checked, and unfortunately, the party in power held. Why is a politician like an atom? They make up everything. And for more election hijinks in old Yugoslavia, only servicemen and veterans could vote. I love this too. The above means pre-World War I. The country was then Montenegro, but Montenegro is hard to explain these days. Just wait until the 1990s. And here's the final one from Ernest Hix, which amazingly was published September 24th of 1948. This was about 6 days after my grandfather died in a small plane crash, which means my grandmother Elsie was running this comic strip under her husband's name 6 days after he died. Incredible. But amazing fact here that voters in India marked their ballots with a thumbprint, thereby making fraud impossible. Apparently, this is the Indians were voting over who was to become part of the new Pakistan, the Muslim state, or Hindustan, the Indian state. And they had heard about all of the vote frauds, not only in the US, but elsewhere, and decided to make it impossible. Voters first registered their thumbprints, then used them in marking the ballots. Which got me thinking, with all the tech billionaires involved in government today, and all the supposed fraud that went on in the 2020 election, wouldn't it make sense that they would be spending their time, energy, and resources implementing something as simple as this to ensure that fraud didn't happen again? And about 3 months later, in December of 1948, it looks like Grandma Elsie was reading through the Los Angeles Examiner on December 5th and came across Will Thrall, who at 75 years old had been elected president of the San Antonio Hiking Club for the 31st time. Trail-wise as a mountain goat, 75-year-old Will Thrall still prefers hiking boots and a rugged climb to slippers and an easy chair. Thrall, who lives at 10 East Beacon Street in Alhambra, has been elected Big Chief Pathfinder of the San Antonio Hiking Club for the 31st successive year. It's not an honorary title. Thrall leads a pack of mountain enthusiasts on several strenuous hikes each year. He has footed it to the top of nearly every peak in Southern California and spread his bedroll in San Gabriel Range nooks from Newhall to the Cajon Pass. 17 times he's climbed peaks above 10,000 feet, and that includes San Jacinto, San Gorgonio, Grayback, and the roughest of them all, San Antonio, which we all knew growing up in the San Gabriel Valley as Mount Baldy. He was a sickly boy back in 1888 when he came to California from Connecticut and had to learn. I had to bike, ride horses, and learn to shoot just to keep up with these wild Westerners, he recalls. He believes a lifetime of hiking, which he calls the world's finest exercise, deserves the credit for his excellent health. I'm not as fast as I once was, but I can still scale those peaks, he says. I'll never stop hiking. It's life to me. And the comic strip, which ran in February 27th of 1949, Will Thrall, 75, still active in the San Antonio Hiking Club, who recently re-elected Big Chief for the 29th consecutive year. And my favorite story about election antics, from 1950, after Elsie had not only taken over the comic strip by function, but also by name, we have Oscar Scott from Jacksonport, Wisconsin, who wheeled a woman down the street in a wheelbarrow. He received a traffic ticket for not having a license to operate the vehicle, for reckless driving, and for having no license plates. And as we learn more about this story, apparently this was an election bet. You may recall the famous photograph of Harry Truman holding up Dewey Won. This is the same election. It was quite a surprise to many people, not the least of which Oscar Scott. And I love this handwritten letter from Oscar Scott to my grandma Elsie. Dear Miss Hix, received your letter this morning, and I'm sending you the clippings from our county newspaper. Also the traffic ticket I received at the end of my trip. The drunken driving charge was out of order. And I love these clippings here of Oscar wheeling Mrs. Morganson down the street in his underwear, with Mrs. Morganson smiling, "I voted for Truman," and Oscar Scott carrying the sign, "I voted for Dewey." Kind of makes you nostalgic, doesn't it? To go back to a time when differences of political opinion could be resolved by a friendly neighborhood wager. And both of them with smiles on their faces. You know, politicians are like diapers. They should be changed often, and for the same reasons. This one from Costa Rica. No president of Costa Rica may be reelected to the presidency at the expiration of his term in office. He must wait 8 years before he again becomes eligible. Not a bad idea to implement here either, do you think? And for the 8th and final election story in the folder, also by my grandma Elsie, backed up by a letter from the Embajada de Costa Rica, Washington, D.C., to Miss Elsie Hix. Yes, it is true, as you say in your letter of November 18th, 1952, that no president of Costa Rica may be reelected to the presidency at the expiration of his term in office. Well, that wraps up this week's episode on election hijinks and antics from the Strange As It Seems archives from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and leaves us with the gentle reminder that laws can change, technology can improve things, and maybe we can all get along and enjoy a joke once in a while, even when our guy doesn't win. Strange as it seems.